First of all, may I express my sincere thanks to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs for the opportunity to take part in this seminar, which is a part of a broader celebration by the people of Sweden of the good fortune of its neighbors to the south, the regaining of independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania 20 years ago. The contribution of Sweden and individual Swedes to the return of freedom in the Baltic states was very important. And as a Latvian, my sincere thanks to all of you. In 1980, the Swedish writer and journalist Anders Kung, whom Mr. Bill mentioned already, wrote a book called A Dream of Freedom. Kung talked about the courageous Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians in their Soviet-occupied homelands who dared to remember the freedom that they once had and to work for the freedom that they would regain. It was a question of faith and belief, personal conviction. But beyond that, nothing much tangible. Little did we know in 1980 that 11 years later, in August 1991, the dream of freedom would materialize in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that all three so-called Baltic republics would throw down the shackles of Soviet totalitarianism and return as independent and democratic countries to the international community. Clearly, this would not have been possible without the parents. And here, this has been stressed by all of the previous speakers, and I have to stress that too, from a Latvian point of view. As independent states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania each have developed bilateral relations with numerous countries throughout the world, probably around 200 each already, and they have become members of international institutions. In some cases, those relations were simply renewed, resumed, because many of the Western countries, particularly at the incentive of the United States non-recognition policy of the legality of the Soviet annexation and incorporation of the Baltic states, juridically continued the diplomatic relations. So this meant resumption. For other countries, it was a development of new relations. But the most dramatic changes came, of course, in the development of relations with what is now known as the Russian Federation, because at that time, as we know, there was a Russian Federation, but it was part of the Soviet Union, and there was also the Soviet Union. And as we know, there were very different currents, political currents and ideas floating in the Soviet Union. President Yeltsin and the Russian Federation was among the very first countries to recognize Baltic independence. This was already on August 24th, 1991. The Soviet Union came a bit later, 6th of September, as was mentioned. And diplomatic relations between Latvia and the Russian Federation resumed on August 4th, 1991. Now, we see nearly 20 years have passed. Those diplomatic relations between the the Soviet Union collapsed, and the successor state of the Soviet Union became the Russian Federation. So this added responsibilities to the Russian Federation, which it did not have before when the Baltic states obtained their independence. What has happened, looking back over the 20 years, what are the trends of Latvian-Russian relations? I would say, historically, we will just look at the agreements that we made, because I think it's a good lever, it's a good tool to simply see what has happened and what kind of development have we had. Initially, as Mr. Lahr pointed out, there was a lot of enthusiasm, there was a lot of goodwill, and that was banked upon in the years 1991, 1992, but then Moscow changed its policies rather dramatically. But in the meanwhile, in those years, and up to 1994, significant progress was made. We have in April 1994 a treaty that was signed between Latvia and the Russian Federation of the removal of the ex-Soviet forces from Latvian territory. That was the major achievement at that time. After that, the relations seemed to stall. There were a couple transit agreements made until 1996, and then there was a complete stall between 1996 and the year 2000. Nothing happened except the exchange of rhetoric. And that rhetoric from Moscow was quite unkind, and the Latvians were accused of all kinds of nasty things, including persecuting their Russian compatriots, etc., etc. And, but at the same time, what is interesting, economic relations did not really suffer that much. But I will talk about economic relations a little bit later. Then things started to change, and the rhetoric changed, but not the general direction of that rhetoric. In the mid-90s, Latvia, as did Estonia and Lithuania, concentrated more and more on its return to Europe, meaning the possibility of joining the European Union and NATO. This, of course, especially the word NATO, was something that was considered a red cloth, something that irritated Moscow to a great degree, to the point where all kinds of tools were being used, including economic sanctions. In 2002, for example, the flow of oil through the port of Ventspils was stopped. So this was really quite serious. But and even in 2004, just before the Baltic states were, by that time, as Estonia, Latvia were, Lithuania joined the EU. There were maneuvers in Moscow to change that, to change the terms, and to essentially torpedo the whole attempt, and to make it something different from what it was. But nonetheless, the Baltic states, all three, managed to join the EU. They joined NATO even before that. So that was also something of an achievement, despite Russia's very firm opposition. Very briefly, what has happened since then? In 2007, this was a turning point. This is when things really started to change. Now we are on an upward trend. Diplomatic progress was made in 2007, and one of the very important agreements was, of course, the border treaty, signed in March. But at the same time, other treaties were signed. Continued progress has persisted now, and the relations are normalizing. They are not perfect, but at the moment we can say they are the best yet since Latvia regained independence. And we are certainly hoping for continued progress and greater development, because the best yet does not mean that they are optimal. There's room for more.